Ronald Reagan had brought a restored economy to the 1980s. His policies saw a rise in business, and corporations were seeing successes that had been lost in the previous decade. Due to this, many Americans were living lavish lifestyles like never before. Although many Americans were living the high life, life wasn't so great for all Americans. Social change in the 1980s greatly impacted the lives of Americans, and we still see the ramifications of the events of the 1980s in our lives today.
During the 1980s, America was hit with new issues that impacted the American people's health, education, and safety. One of the most troubling issues that concerned Americans was the outbreak of the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, also known as AIDS. AIDS is believed to take its origins from the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, when it transferred from chimpanzees to humans in the 1920s. AIDS possibly emerged in the United States in the 1960s when a rare lung infection was diagnosed in 5 young men in Los Angeles. The disease went relatively undiagnosed and baffled doctors. In 1982, the disease was finally labeled as AIDS. AIDS is spread through the bodily fluids that are most readily shared through sexual contact and hypodermic needles. Due to this, most of the early victims were either homosexual or intravenous drug users who shared needles. With a socially conservative administration, many of the victims of the disease felt that the disease was not getting the attention that it should because they felt the administration was against homosexuality and drug use. The disease was largely ignored until it spread to the heterosexual community. The biggest turning point for the acceptance of the disease and increased support for finding the cure came in 1991, when the biggest star in Los Angeles acquired the disease. His name was Magic Johnson.
To the left goes Magic. He's got it. He didn't shoot it. 5 seconds left. Magic down the middle, just what I thought. A hook shot at 12. Yeah!
He was forced to retire from the NBA and began looking for a cure.
Because of the HIV virus that I have attained, I will have to retire from the Lakers.
While there's still no cure, AIDS is no longer the death warrant it once was. Many people live long, successful lives once transmitting the disease. Magic Johnson is still one of the most successful people in the United States, and now owns part of the Los Angeles Dodgers and works as the president of basketball operations for the Los Angeles Lakers. He is an inspiration to those who have contracted the disease and are looking to live long and meaningful lives.
Another health issue that was at the forefront of America in the 1980s was abortion. In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that abortion was legal in Roe v. Wade. This case ruled that abortion during the first trimester was protected by a woman's right to privacy. During the 80s, opponents of abortion quickly united under the banner of pro-life, arguing that human life begins at conception and that no woman has the right to terminate a human life. Proponents of legalized abortion described themselves as pro-choice and argued that reproductive choices were personal health care matters, and noted that many women had died due to unskilled backroom abortions using unsterile methods before abortion was legalized. In 1989, the newly conservative Supreme Court ruled in its decision in Webster v. Reproductive Healthcare Services that states had the right to impose new restrictions on abortion, making abortion laws different from state to state. Abortion was, and still is, a huge issue that divides the nation. Those on today's political left still support a woman's right to choose, and those on today's political right support the pro-life stance that life starts at conception.
According to the Reagan administration, one of the biggest issues with American society during the 1980s was drug abuse. Some people felt that drugs should be legalized to help reduce the power of gangs in the inner cities. Their main method of revenue was selling illegal drugs, and if they were no longer illegal, this would cut off their source of revenue. You can see some of these ideas in play in today's society. Right now, 3 states have legalized marijuana use for recreational purposes. First Colorado, then Washington and California to follow. Many believe it is not long until the entire nation follows. While some wanted to legalize it, others wanted to increase methods to try to treat addiction. The Reagan administration took the stance of trying to eliminate drug use entirely. They launched a war on drugs and pushed for harsher penalties for drug users and dealers. The First Lady Nancy Reagan took this cause as her pet project. She established the White House's stance on the issue and toured the country promoting the slogan, "Just Say No" to drugs. One indirect outcome of the Just Say No movement that you may recognize is the DARE program. The DARE program was started in Los Angeles schools by the LA Police Department. Their goal with the program was to educate children at an early age to prevent drug use. In 1988, Reagan proclaimed the first National DARE Day in support of the program.
In 1983, a federal commission released a report that they titled "A Nation at Risk." This report revealed that U.S. students were beginning to lag behind most other industrialized nations. The report also outlined the fact that 23 million American adults were incapable of reading an instructional manual or capable of filling out a job application form. This showed that basic education needs were not being met, and the commission set out to do something about it. They recommended more homework, longer school days, and an extended school year. They also promoted increased pay and merit pay for teachers, as well as putting a greater emphasis on basic subjects such as English, math, science, social science, and computer science. All of these reactions were an attempt to boost the U.S. back to the lead in education. But in the past 30 years, the United States has made little to no progress in boosting their education numbers on the world stage. Ironically, a lot of the fixes that were suggested by this commission are actually the opposite of the direction that many school districts are taking today. Our district, for example, has limited the amount of homework that teachers are allowed to issue to their students. One area of America in the 1980s that was in dire need of attention was the inner city. The crisis of education was directly connected to the inner city. Many of America's undereducated students lived in big cities, such as Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. Much of the United States had become highly suburbanized in the previous 2 decades, as many white families moved to the more expensive suburbs. As families left, businesses followed, taking jobs and tax revenues from the cities. This migration was known as white flight. White flight left American cities with poorer people and racial minorities dealing with high unemployment rates, crumbling infrastructure, failing school systems, and increasing social problems. With all of these issues, cities began to divide between the haves and the have-nots. These underlying issues in American cities in the 1980s came to a head in the city of Los Angeles in 1992, when 4 white police officers pulled over an African-American man named Rodney King. The police officers were caught on tape beating King to the verge of death. When the officers were found not guilty on charges of police brutality, the city of Los Angeles bursted into flames. The African-American community was fed up with what they felt was unfair treatment, and the injustice of the Rodney King verdict sparked the violence. The Los Angeles riots were deeply rooted in the issues that plagued America's urban communities during the 1980s.
In the 1980s, the fight for women's equality became a very important subject on the national stage. One big fight to help improve the lives of women was the attempt to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Following the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, women proposed an Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. This amendment would guarantee equality of rights for both genders under the law. After decades of work in 1972, Congress finally passed the amendment. In order to institute a new amendment, the states must first ratify it, and in 1982, only 35 of the needed 38 states ratified the amendment. The majority of the states that opposed the amendment were located in the South. This was a big loss for the fight for equality between the genders. In order to combat this loss, Americans began electing women into government, and the Democratic Party even chose the first woman candidate for vice president in Geraldine Ferraro. By 1992, there were 47 women representatives and 6 senators. Reagan began to do his part when he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court and appointed 2 female members to his cabinet, Elizabeth Dunn and Margaret Heckler, as Secretary of Transportation and Health and Human Services, respectively. One of the most blatant forms of inequality between the genders is inequality of pay. During the 80s, women earned about 75 cents for every dollar a man made. Female college graduates earned only slightly more than male high school graduates. In order to close the income gap, women's organizations and unions proposed a system of pay equality. Jobs would be rated on the basis of the amount of education required, the amount of physical strength needed to perform, and the number of people the employee supervised. This would set a new standard of pay rates, which in theory would create standardized pay. 20 states implemented the system of pay to help combat the issue. Another need for working women was new and improved benefit packages. These benefit packages included maternity leaves, flexible hours, and options to work from home. Some of these improvements were launched by individual firms, while others required government intervention.
The 1980s were a time of great difficulty, but minority groups did make advancements during the decade. African Americans gained political seats in major cities all over the country, and Jesse Jackson even ran for the Democratic presidential nomination. The rapidly growing Latino population had representation in President Reagan's cabinet, with Laurel Cavazos as the Secretary of Education and Dr. Antonia Novello becoming the Surgeon General. Native Americans lobbied to the Supreme Court to allow gambling casinos on their land. They won their case, leading the way for tribal casinos that exist in states where gambling is illegal. And a new surge of gay activism emerged in the country, calling for an end to anti-gay discrimination. For American society, The 1980s was a decade in United States history that was defined by hardship. But through the hardship emerged a turning point for change in the right direction.